Hi. In my first video, I talked about the historical and the philosophical context of Kant, and we also did a close reading of the preface. Today, we're going to move on and we're going to talk about the introduction of the Critique of Pure Reason. It's not very long, it's about 20 pages, but it contains a lot of very interesting information, and this is the first time where Kant introduces in the introduction introduces the distinction between a priori and a posteriori. We were already kind of acknowledging that distinction before. We knew all the other philosophers had pointed that out. We have things that we call innate ideas, and other things that we get from experience. Locke denied them. Leibniz rejected Locke's denying of innate ideas. But I will get into that in a little bit. So today we'll do the close reading of the introduction, explain what is this a priori, a posteriori distinction, and also Kant also distinguishes, and this is new, between analytic and synthetic judgment. And we will get to that in a moment. So a priori, a posteriori, analytic, synthetic distinctions. To start this video, I wanted to have a look at one of Kant's letters to one of his students that he wrote in 1772. I'm going to read it out loud. So he's presenting this problem between what is the relationship between objects and object representations. So what's the relationship between objects and the object's representation? So Kant says, what is the ground of the relation of that in us which we call representation to the object? If a representation comprises only the manner in which the subject is affected by the object, then it is easy to see how it is in conformity with this object, namely, as an effect accords with its cause. And if the object itself were created by the representation, as when divine cognitions are conceived as the archetype of things, the conformity of these representations to the object could also be understood. But as to how my understanding may, completely a priori, form for itself concepts of things with which concepts the fact should necessarily agree, and as to how my understanding may formulate real principles concerning the possibility of such concepts, with which principles experience must be in exact agreement, and which nevertheless are independent of experience. This question of how the faculty of understanding achieves this conformity with the things in themselves is still left in a state of obscurity. So let's unpack Kant's words here. So, as I said, this is 1772, a couple of years before the Critique of Pure Reason. Kant is still struggling with the idea that leads him to the Copernican revolution that we talked about in the previous video. Kant says that if the representation of an object is the effect we have of an object, the effect conforms to the object you see. So that's a traditional view. I see an object and my mind conforms to how the object looks like. That's a traditional view. Okay, we conform our cognition, our understanding to how things are in reality. But then we learned about the other version, the other view, which is the option in that our representation is what creates the objects. Kant talks about a divine creation where from the perfect representation the object is created, some sort of Platonic ideas versus objects. And that's one thing that Kant considers. He asks himself how we can, a priori, that is, before experience, form concepts that agree perfectly with nature. Take the idea of causality, for example, a concept that states that every alteration must have a cause. Causality is not derived from experience, because we only see a sequence of events. One thing happened after the other. I touch A moves. We don't see any causality here. It is in our mind, seems like it is in our mind. Still, every single experience of events we have in our lives fits perfectly with our a priori idea of causality. is always the same thing, always happens. When I move A moves. So how does this work? Do we just predict everything 100%? Do we always get it right by some chance of divine luck? Well, how does this work? Are we so in tune with nature that our understanding happened to be synchronized with objects? That's what basically Kant saying in his letter. So we could attempt to argue that causality is like mathematical elements. 2 plus 2 is equal to 4, independently of anyone's experience. So maybe the definition of causality is an obvious one, where alteration and having a cause mean exactly the same way 2 plus 2 and 4 mean exactly the same. But this doesn't work. We can take the word alteration and try to define it as hard as we can to try to make it define as something that has a cause. But is that a good solution? Trying very hard to manipulate and modify definitions so we get what we want? Is it that obvious? Also, do we really learn causality through experience? We will never be able to experience every alteration, every single one in the world, even if they are similar kinds. Induction is not good enough, and this doesn't seem to work either. So we still have the question of how do we get to know causality? Because it cannot be true in virtue of meaning, because alteration cannot be defined as something that has a cause. It's not immediately obvious. So it cannot be known in virtue of meaning, but we can't also get the idea of causality through experience, because we can't. When I move A, I don't see causality I don't see the causality that is getting that A moved every single time I move something. So it's not immediately obvious, and I can also see it from experience. So Kant then considers two options. One, which is what he mentions in the letter, is divine understanding. Causality principle could be known if his creator created it in a world where it is true. God knows it is true because he created it. We are not God, so we cannot know that. So in our human world, we will never be able to know what causality is, only God knows. But that's not valid to us because we are not God. Kant considers a second option, and he says, well, maybe there is a pre-established intellectual harmony. There are certain epistemic principles which are innately implanted into the mind of God. And he ensures that the principle that he has given to us, investigate nature, for us to investigate nature, line up with how nature works. Descartes puts this forward as the rule of truth. Whatever I perceive clearly and distinctly is true because God is not a deceiver. That's what he said. But then Kant doesn't really believe in this. Okay, the pre-established intellectual harmony is very hard to take on board because, in Kant's words, this is a bit of a deus ex machina. It falls in vicious circularity as well, because we perceive things clearly because God is not a deceiver, and also God is not a deceiver because he gives us things very clearly. So it's got that circularity that doesn't solve the problem. So we get the conclusion that this problem is actually quite tricky to solve. We can't get causality by using definitions, but we can also get it from experience. But if we go back to the letter, we can see that in Kant's words there is an anticipation of a pair of distinctions. We have mentioned them in the previous video, but we did not get into it properly to explain them. That's the distinction of a priori and a posteriori, and between analytic and synthetic truths. At the beginning of the letter, he says, if a representation comprises only the manner in which the subject is affected by the object, then it is easy to see how it is in conformity with this object, namely, as an effect accords with its cause. So here Kant is anticipating a posteriori knowledge as a mere effect of objects on us, dependent on experience. And then when he says, and if the object itself were created by the representation as when divine cognitions are conceived as the archetype of beings, the conformity of these representations to the object could also be understood. He's anticipating a priori knowledge, knowledge independent of experience, that we haven't got from experience. And then when he says, but as to how my understanding may, completely a priori, form for itself concepts of things which, with concepts, the fact should necessarily agree, thus anticipating the problem of the synthetic a priori, which we will see in a couple of minutes. Those are synthetic a priori, the concepts that extend our knowledge, give us more information than mere concepts, mere definitions, yet are known priori to experience, but with which experience must agree. And then Kant says, and as to how my understanding may formulate real principles concerning the possibility of such concepts, with which principles experience must be in exact agreement, and which nevertheless are independent of experience. This harmony, this pre-established harmony, this question is still left in a state of obscurity. How do we get causality right all the time? So he's anticipating his critical project in a critique of pure reason, which is trying to explain how synthetic a priori knowledge, which according to Kant are the propositions of traditional metaphysics, causality, geometry, are possible. Right, so let's get into the first distinction, which is the a priori and a posteriori. You probably know this distinction is very easy to understand. So, just briefly, a priori knowledge is knowledge that is obtained independently from experience, not from experience. And a posteriori knowledge comes from experience. Easy to define. Cool. So, into a priori knowledge. So something is not a priori if, not also we don't get it from experience, but also if it's necessary. It is not contingent. It could not have been otherwise. For example, the addition of all the angles of a triangle add up to 2 right angles. That is a necessary truth. Could not have been otherwise in this world. And it is also a priori, because we do not need experience to know this is true. In fact, you will never see perfect triangles represented in the real world where it actually adds up to 180 degrees. Probably it would get really, really close, but reality is a version of the actual mathematical truth. So it may not be perfect. There is an objection to this, and that is that, well, okay, yeah, it adds up to 180 degrees, but I did not know this when I was 5 years old. How can that be a priori? I did not know that. I had to go to class and learn it. I required experience to know that piece of knowledge in order to obtain this and many more pieces of mathematical knowledge. This is precisely the criticism of Locke about innate ideas. He called them that way instead of a priori knowledge, but means the same thing, innate ideas that we had before being born, or the moment, or we acquire them the moment we are born. He said that there are no ideas impressed upon the mind, and we are not conscious of such ideas prior to coming to know them. And that is Locke's criticism. There was a response to Locke's criticism set by Leibniz, his famous analogy of in the new essays of the veined marble. So in his new essays, he replied to Locke with the example of a sculptor trying to sculpt a piece of art. We do have innate ideas, but they are hidden like veins in a block of marble, where the sculptor has to uncover them by polishing the marble, and then the piece of art is inside it. That's what Michelangelo said as well. The piece of art is inside the sculpture. You just need to uncover it. It's already there. You're not aware of it until you use your reason and discover it. That's the analogy, that's the metaphor that Leibniz proposed. That's what he calls dispositional a priori. So the actual knowledge of them is not innate. What is innate is what we may call the potential knowledge of them, the potential knowledge of that sculpture. As the veins of the marble outline a shape which is in the marble before they are uncovered by the sculpture. That's what he said Leibniz in his new essays. Kant is going to follow that conception. The a priori knowledge that we have of objects for Kant does require experience in a certain way. I had to go to class to learn some mathematical truths, but it is not knowledge which is gained from experience. I just discover it, I uncover it. Experience is more like the catalyst for the mind to develop the concepts to which is innately disposed. This is why, at the beginning of the introduction, I believe is at B1, he claims that, I'm quoting, there can be no doubt that all our knowledge begins with experience. That's the first sentence of the introduction. Experience awakens our faculty of knowledge into action. We have no knowledge antecedent from experience, and with experience all knowledge begins. But even though this is true, Kant also says, though all our knowledge begins with experience, it does not follow that it all arises out of experience. It starts with experience, but it does not originally arises from experience. A priori knowledge does not originate from experience, but it awakens with the world. When we see what is written on the board in maths class, we see it. Okay, it begins there, but it does not arise in there. So that is the idea of a priori. Okay, that the main idea that we need to remember is that even though we don't know it at the beginning of our life, it's already the dispositional knowledge is already inside us, and we just need to discover it through experience. A posteriori knowledge. I could give you an example. You could say the sky is blue. It could have been otherwise. The sky could have been purple, the sky could have been pink. It is contingent, okay? And knowable only a posteriori. This is things that we will never be able to know, we will never be able to discover, and they originate from experience. Pretty straightforward. I don't think we need to learn much more about it. You probably know a lot of things a posteriori already. So the more interesting distinction is the distinction between analytic and synthetic judgment. It is different from a priori and a posteriori. Okay, they're completely different distinctions. Okay, they're not related to each other. Let's start with the analytic. The analytic could be defined as if a judgment is analytic, the predicate then is covertly contained in the concept of whatever we're talking about. For example, all bachelors are unmarried. The most typical example that they give you when you talk about analytic judgment. In the definition of bachelor is already the fact that you are unmarried. You are not learning anything new with this statement. I could also say all bodies are extended. That is true. I mean, if you are a body, you're gonna more or less occupy a space. You probably can notice that analytic judgments are true in virtue of the meaning of the terms involved. It is in the definition, as I said. The definition of a bachelor is an unmarried man, and that analytic judgment are all a priori. Okay? So all analytic judgments are going to be a priori. Analytic a posteriori judgments don't exist. Cool. Okay, because everything is on the definitions. You don't need experience for that. Right, synthetic. So the synthetic judgments are not analytic judgments. And if it's not analytic, it must be synthetic. Kant mainly starts explaining the differences and defines what the synthetic judgments are at around B10 in the critique. By the way, my edition is Norman Keith Smith's edition. Right, so the predicate B in synthetic judgments lies entirely outside of the concept A. Although it is true, there is a connection between them. So if I say there are 70 million people in the UK, I am stating two things that are related, 70 million people, and the UK has 70 million people. But just by saying UK, I do not get the idea of 70 million people. Yeah, the fact that UK has 70 million people is outside of the definition of the UK. So I extend my knowledge with it. Therefore, it is synthetic. I could also say some cats are orange. I could not have known that without seeing an orange cat. And also, the definition of a cat does not state that they have to be orange. Not all synthetic judgments are empirical, even though Kant's predecessors, like Leibniz and Hume, would think the opposite, that all predicates that are outside the subject are all empirical. Kant thinks that there are some synthetic judgments that are not empirical but a priori. And this is something new that he's bringing to the table. So this is the famous birth of the synthetic a priori, the famous synthetic a priori. What is it? Most statements that are a synthetic a priori, are mathematical truths, some metaphysical truths, and geometry or some science. Some pieces of knowledge from science. For example, in mathematics, all knowledge are necessities in mathematics. 2 plus 2 equals 4 is a necessary truth. Thus, it is a priori, we already know that. Plus, it is non-trivial because you're learning something. When you say 2 plus 2 equals 4, you're learning that if you put 2 and 2 together, you're going to get 4. It does give us new information. You realize that 2 plus 2 is equal to 4. It was not immediately obvious from the first time you saw it. That is a little bit more substantive than saying, for example, all bachelors are on merit. They're also synthetic. In natural science, for example, Newtonian physics, much of it Kant thinks are a synthetic a priori judgment. For some parts, not all of them, okay? The key physical principles, like the conservation of energy, of the quantity of matter, are a priori, or that every action has a reaction. All of that is synthetic a priori. Kant has talked about mathematics, he's talked about science. What about metaphysics? Metaphysics obviously cannot be taken into science, as we talked about in the previous video, but does metaphysics have any a priori synthetic judgments? Well, Kant thinks that you can apply the same concepts, the same logic to fit metaphysics from mathematics and physics. Here you've got a table of the summary of what we talked so far. So a priori, conceptual truths, they're true in virtue of meaning or definition, and they are trivial. They don't give you any new information. And then you have synthetic a priori, which is mathematics, some natural science, possibly metaphysics. That's what Kant is trying to discover in the Critique of Pure Reason. And it is substantive. It gives you knowledge. It is expansive. And then you have a posteriori and also synthetic. Those are the truths known through the empirical world, testimony, experience, inference from direct experience, experiments. And then a posteriori analytic, it doesn't exist. Okay, it doesn't have. There's no piece of knowledge that are both analytic and a posteriori, because if you have an analytic judgment, it's going to be obvious from the definition. You don't need experience to discover it. Now, there are some problems with the synthetic a priori distinction. The first objection that has been put forward was the objectivity problem, and that was put forward by some Leibnizians. One of them is called J.G. Maas, and the other one is J.A. Everhard. These papers that I'm going to mention down below, the main idea of their papers is that Kant does not have an objective criteria for distinguishing what is analytic and what is synthetic judgments. So they're saying that two different subjects might think different things from the same concept. For one person it may be analytic, for another it may be synthetic. What may be synthetic for A is analytic for B. Maybe for someone that doesn't know anything about physics, acceleration is synthetic, because I don't really understand it under the physicist lenses. But it could be analytic for a physicist. It may seem very obvious for them that is aware of the mathematical formulas. It may be analytic for them. I might know it roughly as the speed is getting bigger or the speed is getting smaller. I may be able to look at it in a graph, but it's definitely not analytic for me. So to understand it, I need to look at examples, a car speeding up or above or whatever. But for a physicist, the concept defined mathematically is obvious, and it doesn't need an example. They don't need an example to understand what acceleration is. They just have the formula, which I believe is A equals dv over dt or something. So the rate of change of velocity with respect to time. So once they've accepted the definition of velocity and time, this is the physicist, the definition of acceleration follows analytically. It's contained in the concepts already. They don't need to watch a car or drop a ball to know what acceleration means. In my opinion, this is not really a good objection. It could have a pretty straightforward response, and that's what Van Clever did in 1999 in his paper down there. And also it was put forward by a student of Kant himself. Yeah, I might think about acceleration in a different way than a physicist, precisely because we are thinking about two different concepts, although expressing the same words. So the physicist and I have different things in mind by acceleration. They are different judgments. One of them is synthetic, the one is a priori. Is the strategy of just stating that we are talking about two different concepts good enough then? Is it good enough? Are we actually talking about two different things? If Kant claims that geometrical knowledge is synthetic, and Leibnizians claim that it is analytic, then are they talking about two different concepts? Are they two different geometries? Not really. They mean the same geometry. So how is my concept of acceleration just going to be different from the physicist's concept of acceleration? How is that different? So that's something to have in mind. So it does have problems, that objectivity problem. Also, Kant realized that someone may put an objection to this, and he gave what we call a logical test for analyticity. Check that something is analytical. At B12 in the introduction, he proposes that S if P, so S is P, subject is a predicate, is analytic if, with two F's, S is not P entails a contradiction. Something is P is a predicate necessarily, so analytically, if the opposite turns into a contradiction. It could not have been otherwise. For example, all bachelors are unmarried men. So that's the standard analytic reading. So all bachelors are unmarried is analytic because unmarried is contained in the concept of bachelor. But if I deny it, some bachelors are married, that produces a contradiction because it is contradictory. It's not on the definition. And that is analytic, right? But now consider the morning star is Venus. Just an example that I just made up. So if you deny it, the morning star is not Venus. Is that a contradiction? Not logically. It is an empirical fact that the morning star is Venus. So denying it is false empirically. It's not actually true. But it does not entail a contradiction. It could have been otherwise. It could have been Mars in a purely conceptual sense. Therefore, it is not an analytical judgment. So the problem here is that, except in the case of logical tautologies, A is equal to A, whether a judgment about S entails a contradiction depends on what the content of S is. So it's very hard to do a test of what is analytic and what is not, because it heavily depends on the context and the content of it. I could also say the tallest person in the room is tall. I'm in a classroom and I say the tallest person in the room is tall. Well, I'm saying that the person that happens to be the tallest in this room is tall. The denial of this judgment would be the tallest person in the room is not tall. Does this denial entail a contradiction? I don't think so. Because it depends on the content of the tallest person in the room. I could be in a room full of really, really short people, like myself, and I may happen to be the tallest person in the room. Am I actually tall? No. So it really depends on what situation you're in. It really depends on the content. So if there is someone in the room, then by definition of tallest, they are indeed tall relative to the others, but denying it may seem contradictory. But if everyone in the room is very short and the tallest is still not objectively tall, denying is not strictly contradictory. So Kant seems to give no way of determining this content other than a psychological test. So we're back with the initial problem. And if you want to read more about this, you can see, and you can refer to Hogan's paper, the 2013 one. I'm living down there as well, for more on that issue. But Kant is aware of this, and he gives another response, which is what we know as cognitive legitimacy. What is cognitive legitimacy? He puts it very well in AA 20-408-9. I'm going to read you the quote here. So he says, let someone put into the concept of the subject so many attributes that the predicate one wishes to prove of the subject can be derived from his concept merely by the law of contradiction. The critical philosophy permits him to make this kind of analytic judgment, but raises a question about the concept of the subject itself. It asks, how did you come to conclude to include in this concept the different attributes so that it entails synthetic propositions? First, prove the objective reality of your concept, i.e., first prove that any one of its attributes really belongs to a possible object. And when you have done that, then prove that the other attributes belong to the same thing that the first one belongs to, without themselves belonging to the first attribute. The whole question of how much or how little the concept of the subject is to contain has not the least bearing on the metaphysical question: how are synthetic a priori judgments possible? Let's unpack this. It's quite an interesting extract. He basically says, when he says, let someone put into the concept of the subject so many attributes, blah, 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 he's saying that some people try to make analytic judgments by stuffing a lot of attributes into a concept. For example, if you define event as an effect occurring at a point in time, then if you define it that way, you could analytically infer every event has a cause, because cause is already in the definition. But Hume criticized this because just defining something to include the property doesn't prove that it actually exists in the world. You're just stuffing things into the definition. We're asking ourselves, when he's asking himself in the extract, how did you come to include in this concept different attributes so that it entails synthetic propositions? How do you know? Analytic judgments are about concepts, not necessarily about real things. So Kant asks himself, if you want to claim an analytic judgment tells us something about the world, you first need to establish the objective reality of your concept. Show that there is actually some object in the world that fits the concept. Only then you can safely say all the attributes of the concept apply to that object. But analytic judgment can't do that. They can't do that on their own, and they can't tell us anything about the world. They only tell us what's contained in the concept. So, to make claims about reality, even ones that seem analytic, you must first perform a synthetic move. So, show that the concept really applies to something. So this is why existential claims like there exists a god or there exists whatever are always synthetic for Kant. Not the one about God, but the one about anything. There exists a computer. So that is synthetic because it's not the fact that it is, as we talked about in the Anselm's ontological argument in the previous video, the fact that something exists, that's not a perception, that's not something that you can just see from the subject. Unicorns exist, I could say, but that doesn't mean that they actually exist. This also has incurred some detractors. The most famous one, who published a very famous paper, Two Dogmas of Empiricism, Quine's critique of analyticity. So in this famous paper that you should definitely read, is worth reading, is quite an interesting paper, Quine questions whether analyticity exists at all. His argument, as proposed by Van Clever in his paper, is the following. 1. If a proposition is analytic, it is immune to revision. 2. No proposition is such that no one ever reasonably rejects it. 3. Conclusion, therefore, no proposition is actually analytic. This also has some sort of problems, right? First one, against one, and the first premise, not all analytic propositions are immune to revision. Take, for example, the theorems of formal logic. I may make crazy statements, but they're still valid if you look at them logically. I can prove the existence of unicorns, for example, and that is false, but I can make an argument about it that could be perfectly valid. That is not true. Proposition 1 is just not true. And against the second proposition, no proposition is such that no one could reasonably reject it. Some analytical statements are very hard to reject. So how are you going to reject that the square has 4 sides? How are you going to reject that a triangle has 3 angles? It's impossible, at least at the moment. So a proposition is going to be true or false at the same time, for example. How are you going to prove that wrong? He also talks about synonymy and interchangeability, contradiction. We don't have time to talk about it right now, but definitely give it a read. You can analyze his arguments with your own reason. Right, Okay, so that is the information about a priori, a posteriori, analytic, and synthetic. I would like to have a look more closely into Kant's quotes in the introduction of the Critique of Pure Reason, and we'll take a couple of interesting quotes. Right, section 1. So in section 1, Kant gives the distinction between a priori and a posteriori. He says at B1, there can be no doubt that all our knowledge begins with experience. Experience awakens our faculty of knowledge into action. We have no knowledge antecedent from experience, and with experience all knowledge begins. Well, even though this is true, Kant says that though all our knowledge begins with experience, it does not follow that it all arises out of experience. And this is what I've explained before. The fact that it's a priori doesn't mean you have to know it from the moment you're born. You need to discover it through experience. So a priori knowledge does not originate from experience, but it awakens with experience. At bit 2, we have the distinction between a priori and a posteriori. Kant says that whether there is any knowledge that is thus independent of experience and even of all impressions of the senses, such knowledge is entitled a priori and distinguished from the empirical, which has its sources a posteriori, that is, in experience. But we have to be careful not to give a priori judgments more credit than they deserve. And this is what Kant says at B2. For it has been customary to say, even of much knowledge that is derived from empirical sources, that we have it or are capable of having it a priori, meaning thereby that we do not derive it immediately from experience, but from a universal rule, a rule which is itself, however, borrowed by us from experience. It comes from a universal rule, a rule which is itself, however, borrowed from experience. So a priori knowledge is not merely a universal law, a universal rule. Most of these universal rules, as Kant says, are derived from experience. He gives the example of a man whose house was poorly built, and knowing this, he could have the a priori knowledge of the fact that it will fall, but he does not need to wait for the house to fall to know that it is going to fall. Also, B2 Kant says, but still, he could not know this completely a priori, the fact that the house was going to fall. For he had first to learn through experience that bodies are heavy and therefore fall when their supports are withdrawn. He would not know that his house was going to fall. He did not have that a priori knowledge of that bodies that are heavy fall. He also gives a definition of a priori knowledge at B2.3. He says, we so understand by a priori knowledge, not knowledge independent of this or that experience, but knowledge absolutely independent of all experience. And then a definition of empirical knowledge at B3, which is knowledge, possibly only a posteriori, that is through experience. From this we have two modes of a priori knowledge that Kant establishes at this point at B3. So a priori knowledge is pure when there is no admixture of anything empirical, so it's pure a priori knowledge, but then a priori knowledge could also be not pure. So it could be not pure when the concept from which the knowledge is based on derives from experience. For example, if I say every alteration has its cause, so it could be pure, not pure. We move to section 2, and that's when we talk about how to distinguish between pure and empirical knowledge. At B3, Kant says, experience teaches us that a thing is so and so, but not that it cannot be otherwise. First, then, we have a proposition which is being thought is thought as necessary. It is an a priori judgment, and if besides it is not derived from any proposition except one which also has the validity of a necessary judgment, it is an absolutely a priori judgment. Secondly, experience never confers on its judgments true or strict, but only assumed a comparative universality through induction. A priori knowledge is necessary, it cannot be otherwise, and empirical knowledge is what we get by using induction, which does not work very well. It never works very well when we want to make universal truths, and that's what Hume said as well when he talked about induction and causality. We need to take a different approach. We can just use induction to make those universal claims. At B4, then Kant says, if then a judgment is thought with strict universality, that is, in such a manner that no exception is allowed as possible, it is not derived from experience, but is valid absolutely a priori. So again, those are the pure a priori. Kant distinguishing between empirical universality and strict universality. That's also another distinction. Empirical universality is only an arbitrary extension of a validity holding in most cases to one which holds in all, for instance, in the proposition all bodies are heavy. When, on the other hand, strict universality is essential to a judgment, this indicates a special source of knowledge, namely a faculty of a priori knowledge. Necessity and strict universality are thus sure criteria of a priori knowledge and are inseparable from one another. Necessity is strict universality. The fact that the triangle has three sides is necessary and it could not have been otherwise, and that is strict universality. Summary: empirical universality, for example, the proposition every event has a cause, and strict universality, any mathematical proposition is strictly universal. Then Kant goes on and explains a little mind experiment to prove that space is something a priori. He goes and says at B5, B6, if we remove our empirical concept of a body one by one, every feature in it which is merely empirical, the colour, the hardness or softness, the weight, even the impenetrability, there still remains the space which the body, now entirely vanished, occupied, and this cannot be removed. If we think about an object, let's say I think about this book, and I try to take away everything empirical about the book, the colour, the hardness or the softness, so all the what we say secondary qualities of this book, I will only have the space it occupies. I can't really take away from my experiment, from my mind, the fact that it occupies a space. That's the only thing that I can't vanish, right? So that cannot be removed. Right, so section 3. Philosophy needs a science of a priori knowledge. We need a systematic way to figure out what knowledge we can have independently of experience. How far does that knowledge go, and the limits of the knowledge. But the problem here is that our reason is not satisfied with objects of experience. We want to go beyond experience and face unavoidable problems with God, the immortality of the soul, the conception of the soul. We always put ourselves in those situations where we don't really have an answer to if we just want to use reason. So we have jumped to the no-empirical realm. Now, at B7, Kant says, now it does indeed seem natural that as soon as we have left the ground of experience, we should, through careful inquiries, assure ourselves as to the foundation of any building that we propose to erect, not making use of any knowledge that we possess without first determining whence it has come, and not trusting the principles without knowing their origin. It is natural, that is to say, the question should first be considered how the understanding can arrive at all this knowledge a priori, and what extent, validity, and worth it may have. How do we get a priori knowledge in philosophy? Mathematics does it all the time. How do we do it in philosophy? Kant asks. At B8, he says, mathematics gives us a shining example of how far, independently of experience, we can progress in a priori knowledge. But we can very easily be misled, because like Plato's stove, which is the example that Kant gives, like Plato's stove, reason thinks it can fly better in empty space, so pure thought, than within the limits of experience. In doing so, it sometimes just plays with concepts instead of extending knowledge. We just build castles in the air, but we're not really extending our knowledge. There's two different activities of reason that Kant proposes. So one is analysis, breaking down the concept we already have, and that's something that we could use in mathematics, in physics, in some sciences. And the other is something else, attaching new predicates to concepts which look like an extension of knowledge. That could be another application, reason. At section 4, Kant makes a distinction between analytic and synthetic judgments. At B10, he says, either the predicate B belongs to the subject A as something which is, in brackets, covertly contained in this concept A, or B lies outside the concept A, although it does indeed stand in connection with it. In the one place, I entitled a judgment analytic, in the other synthetic. Analytic judgments are therefore those in which the connection of the predicate with the subject is thought through identity. Those in which this connection is thought without identity should be entitled synthetic. Analytic judgments are explicative, as he says, because the predicate does not add to the content of the subject, but only breaks up the contents in its constituent parts that were already there. If I say, using Kant's example, all bodies are extended, which is an analytic judgment, when we think about a body, we cannot think in any other way but without extension. So they are necessary because it is a necessary truth that all bodies are extended. So these analytic truths, these analytic judgments are necessary, but we need something else because they're just explicative. They just explain, but they don't extend knowledge. At B1314, Kant says, analytic judgments are very important and indeed necessary, but only for obtaining that clearness in a concept which is requisite for such a sure and wide synthesis as will lead to a genuinely new addition to all previous knowledge. So, on the other hand, synthetic judgments are ampliative because, according to Kant, they add to the concept of the subject a predicate which has not been in any wise thought in it and which no analysis could possibly extract from it, and they may therefore be entitled ampliative. That's what he says at B11. All bodies are heavy, and the predicate heavy is not in a definition of what a body is, so it is synthetic, it is not analytic. Synthetic judgments extend our knowledge that we by experience, which help us to put the concept of body and weight together. But it just comes from the experience that we know that all bodies are heavy. However, we do not have the same help from experience when we talk about synthetic a priori knowledge. Kant says at B13, but in a priori synthetic judgments, this help is entirely lacking. I do not here have the advantage of looking around in the field of experience. Upon what, then, am I to rely when I seek to go beyond the concept A and to know that another concept B is connected with it? Where is the synthetic in this type of judgments? Kant takes the example of the proposition everything which happens has a cause, causality, and Kant says that everything which happens and cause are not analytic. But the concept of cause, he says at B13, lies entirely outside the other concept and signifies something different from that which happens, and is not therefore in any way contained in this latter representation. So then, how can it be a priori if it is synthetic? How come then, Kant says at B13 again, how come I then to predicate that which happens something quite different, and to apprehend that the concept of cause, though not contained in it, yet belongs, and indeed necessarily belongs to it? Suppose you tried to say, we know from experience that everything that happened has a cause. We have a problem. Problem number one, experience gives no necessity. So experience can show you that in all the cases you've observed, event had causes. But it can never prove that is always going to be the case, that it must always be true. There's no universality in it. And that's what Hume already said. Experience can't give necessity only so far, always. Problem number two, experience is limited. You only observe some events, never all possible events. You can't experience all possible causes. Yet the principle says everything that happens. So how are you going to know that everything is going to have a cause? That universality goes beyond what experience could justify. So if the judgment has the marks of necessity and universality, it can't come from experience. Kant says at B13 again, it cannot be experience because the suggested principle has connected the second representation with the first, not only with greater universality, but also with the character of necessity, and therefore completely a priori and on the basis of mere concepts. Upon such synthetic, that is, ampliative principles, all our a priori speculative knowledge must ultimately rest. Analytic judgments are very important, and then he goes on and says that they're important, but we need to expand our knowledge. The synthetic a priori character comes from this one, that the synthetic because cause is not considered in the concept of event, and then is a priori because you couldn't learn universality and necessity from experience, but you still judge it that way. So that's the end of section 4. In section 5, we have the synthetic a priori judgments that are everywhere in the sciences. So those are mathematics, science, and metaphysics. Let's start with mathematics. Kant says at B14 that all mathematical judgments, without exception, are synthetic. So even though they are a priori, we already have established that mathematics are a priori because they are necessary truths that cannot be derived from experience. Kant said this may surprise some people at the time that further mathematics is purely analytic because it is derived from the principle of no contradiction. So Kant saying that mathematics are not analytic could be quite surprising, sounds surprising to many people. An example of this, so if I say 7 plus 5 is 12, many people would think that is analytic because 7 plus 5 is already contained in 12 and 12 is contained in 7 plus 5. The concept of 7 plus 5 already contains 12, so the truth would be analytic. But Kant is challenging this view. Kant says, well, no, mathematical truths add something new to the concept. So if you analyze the concept of 7 plus 5, you can't find 12 just by unpacking it. You actually have to construct the sum in your head. You have to think about 7 dots, and then 5 dots, and then what happens if you put all of those dots together. Kant says, but if we look more closely, we find that the concept of the sum of 7 and 5 contains nothing save the union of the two numbers into one. And in this, no thought is being taken as to what that single number may be which combines both. The concept of 12 is by no means already thought in merely thinking this union of 7 and 5. It gets a little bit easier if you talk about bigger numbers, so 1,300 plus 5,900. You have to actually work that out. It's not that you have the solution in your head already and you know that is whatever it is. They are different, it's not, one is not contained in the other. At least that is what Kant would argue. Therefore, maths is synthetic. Then at B15 he says, for though a synthetic proposition can indeed be discerned in accordance with the principle of contradiction, this can only be if another synthetic proposition is presupposed, and if it can then be apprehended as following from this other proposition. It can never be so discerned in and by itself. That is very interesting, how he's bringing that traditional view, mathematics are analytic, and actually saying no, it is synthetic. Kant gives another example, the fact that the straight line between 2 points is the shortest line, but then he argues the same thing. You cannot derive one concept from the other. We require intuition to relate the two concepts together instead of the concept being thought in the other concept itself. We know that is not the case now. So like the shortest line between 2 points does not necessarily have to be this a straight line, because we have non-Euclidean mathematics, but Kant did not know this because that part of mathematics was still not developed at that time. So yeah, just as a punctualization, not all statements in geometry and mathematics are synthetic. Some of them are analytic, but they're very obvious. They can also be, they're self-explanatory, like A is equal to A. The whole is greater than its part. Those would be analytic judgments coming from mathematics, or more like logic. Moving on to physics, natural sciences in general, they contain a lot of a priori synthetic judgments. For example, the principle of conservation of matter, the principle of action and reaction that I've talked about before. These propositions are necessary, thus a priori, but they're also synthetic, because when I think about matter, I analytically know that they occupy space, and it could be by definition larger or smaller, but by definition I know it occupies a space. But I do not think of one of its immediate qualities being permanence. I know that matter occupies a space, but I don't need to know that matter is going to be permanent forever. So I get to know that after, even though it is a priori, as I do not need experience for it. So that's the thing with metaphysics and the preservation of matter. What about metaphysics? Kant thinks that metaphysics, even though it has failed so far, as a science contains multiple asynthetic, a priori synthetic judgments. The first thing that he says is that metaphysics cannot be analytical because it needs to extend our knowledge of the world, otherwise it wouldn't really gives us anything new. Physics is also a priori because you cannot extract metaphysical knowledge from empirical matter. How are you gonna extract metaphysical truths from things that are not metaphysical? Metaphysical by its name means beyond matter. So it would be contradictory, would not make sense. Many people would argue, it can be one of them, that the statement, the world must have a first beginning, is a priori synthetic judgment in metaphysics. We will come back to that statement, but that's the example that Kant gives at B16 or B17. Section 6. On section 6, Kant develops or gives a setting about the bounds of reason. So first, Kant clearly states the limits of reason. At B23, he says, when one's reason has learned completely to understand its own power in respect of objects which can be presented to it in experience, it should really be able to determine with completeness and certainty the extent and the limits of his attempted employment beyond the bounds of all experience. Then on section 7, he goes on to talk about what is pure reason and how should we apply it, what is it. So Kant gives a couple of definitions about pure reason. So the first one is at B24. Reason is the faculty which supplies the principles of a priori knowledge. He also says that pure reason is that which contains the principles whereby we know anything absolutely a priori. And he also says that we can create a system where we collect these principles, but we won't call it a doctrine. It can't be a doctrine, it can only be a critique. It can be self-axioms. It is a critique because you can build on it, or if you find things that are wrong, you can replace them. He also gives a definition of the transcendental. He says at, I think it's B24 as well, I entitle transcendental all knowledge which is occupied not so much with objects as with the mode of a knowledge of objects, in so far as this mode of knowledge is to be possible a priori. Basically, the system of knowledge concerned with the conditions that make a priori knowledge of objects possible. And this system will be able to test our faculty of reason and set its limits. There's also a very interesting passage at B27 where he talks about what is transcendental philosophy. He says, transcendental philosophy is only the idea of a science for which the critique of pure reason has to lay down the complete architectonic plan. That is to say, it has to guarantee, as following from principles, the completeness and certainty of the structure in all its parts. It is the system of all principles of pure reason. And if this critique is not itself to be entitled a transcendental philosophy, it is solely because, to be a complete system, it would also have to contain an exhaustive analysis of the whole of a priori human knowledge. Our critique must indeed supply a complete enumeration of all the fundamental concepts that go to constitute such pure knowledge. Basically, transcendental philosophy only deals with what is a priori and synthetic, and that's what we call transcendental philosophy. So at the very end of this introduction, Kant gives us a little flavour of what the two main stems of human knowledge are from him. The first one is sensibility, which is how objects are given to us, and the second one is understanding, which is how objects are thought to us. We will know that the sensibility is what we see in space and time, and that will give rise to his transcendental idealism and transcendental aesthetics. And the second one is the understanding, so that would relate to the categories and the things that we use to understand concepts, to process the world as we see it. But this is a matter of the next video where I will talk about the transcendental aesthetic. I will give a bit of a mind map of how the critique is going to be structured from now on, and then I will go on and explain transcendental aesthetics. It was a pleasure to make another video. Keep tuned for the next one. Bye.